The Supreme Court's decision next week on Arizona's immigration law won't end the debate or the legalities.
It's inevitable once this is put into effect. It will violate the Fourth Amendment or other rights.
But many say the law as it stands is necessary.
The way that the statute reads says that racial profiling is not allowed to the extent permitted by the Constitution.
Tonight on Arizona Week, the SB 1070 waiting game and what's next.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chiha.
In our politically divided society, no division seems more stark than on the issue of illegal immigration. Next week's decision on Arizona's law may not change much, at least for now. We look at the pros, the cons, and why this is so important. First, Arizona Capital Times reporter Jeremy Duda on what to expect when the Supreme Court rules. Jeremy, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Michael.
Tell us what happens next week when the Supreme Court issues its decision on SB 1070.
Well, it depends a little bit on exactly what they issue. If they uphold it or uphold it in part, it might go into effect immediately. I think that's kind of the general expectation, but it could have a delayed effective date, or they might send it back down to the lower court and tell Judge Bolton to lift the injunction she put on it back in 2010.
So if it goes into effect immediately, what happens? How does the state then roll it out at that point?
Well, Governor Brewer has ordered AZ Post, the Police Officer Standards and Training Board, to redistribute all the training materials they put out in 2010, kind of give everyone a refresher course. They might have to change some things up depending on which parts are upheld, which parts are struck down. That's the big question. I think the main expectation is that they are going to uphold the main provision, which is the one requiring police officers to check immigration status if they have a reasonable suspicion. But some of the other stuff, we're not quite as sure. Even the supporters aren't quite as confident, and everyone's waiting to see what they're going to do.
And would you say that with the governor's order that the training for police officers be reissued, that the state is poised to implement right away?
I think so, probably. A lot of these police agencies, they've gone through all this training, 2 years ago. They've been waiting for this for a while and, just kind of had to sit on their hands.
And a good bit of this training is aimed at the idea of upholding the ban or the limit on racial profiling in the law. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's what a lot of it focuses on, exactly what police officers can use to determine reasonable suspicion, because this is obviously the touchiest part of the law and the most likely to lead to lawsuits after the court ruling if they uphold it. The ACLU and a lot of other groups are really poised to jump on any allegations of racial profiling and file lawsuits based on that.
Now, what's the atmosphere like over at the Capitol and in the executive office tower where the governor's office is? Are people nervous? Are they anxious, eager? What would you describe it as?
It's hard to say. I think they're pretty confident about that main provision, the reasonable suspicion provision, and that's really the only one that anyone's focused on much. The other big provision, probably the other pillar of it, is the one that basically makes it a state crime to be in the country illegally. But you haven't heard much talk of that, so you hear a lot of confidence about that main part.
And specifically, what have you heard the governor say about it? She, from what I've seen, is expressing cautious optimism about implementation of the law. What are you hearing from her?
About the same. She's careful to, obviously she wants to try and allay some of these fears, criticisms, accusations about racial profiling and that kind of thing.
And you mentioned some of the groups that may be opposed to this, including the ACLU. What kinds of things are you hearing from political opponents to SB 1070?
Well, people are preparing for basically the next round of lawsuits. The biggest fear about this from opponents has been racial profiling, but that's not really a lawsuit you can launch until it goes into effect, because you can argue all day long that it will lead to racial profiling, but until you've seen how it actually looks when police officers enforce it, you can't prove that in a court of law.
Now, under the expected scenario that the Supreme Court upholds all of the law or good parts of it, especially the law enforcement aspect of it, what are the political implications going forward? Is that going to embolden conservatives even more to try more things, or what do you think about that?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there's always going to be a faction down there at the legislature that wants to, push the envelope, go harder. You saw back in 2011, the first session after 1070, there was a whole spate of, pretty harsh anti-illegal immigration bills, and they all failed. But there's no reason to believe that some of them won't get reintroduced.
And they failed because some Republicans, and including people in the business community, rose up there. Would we expect that opposition to continue, do you think, if there is a new wave?
Oh, absolutely. The Chamber of Commerce and those business groups and, the Republicans in the legislature who are their closest allies, they don't want to see any more of this stuff. Arizona's gotten, they don't like the controversy. They don't like the bad press. They don't like, waves after wave of protest marches going past the Capitol. They just want things to quiet down.
And under the scenario that some or all of the law or the four parts of the law that are before the Supreme Court would get turned down or get rejected by the Supreme Court, what are the political implications there? Are the Republicans going to rush to try to fix it?
Oh, I have to imagine they would. If by some chance it all got struck down, I'm sure the first thing you'd see, once they got ready for the next session, is some kind of successor bill. Remember the last one with 1070, Russell Pierce and Chris Kobach and those other attorneys, they spent a long time working on this, so they've got a while to go before the next session starts, and if that happens, I'm sure they'll get right to work again.
We only have about a half a minute remaining. Do you think they'd call a special session, Jeremy, to get some things in place while they still have their supermajorities before this fall's election?
There'd be some folks clamoring for it, I'm sure, especially because any Republicans who are wavering, you can use the upcoming primary elections as to lean on them for that. But there probably wouldn't be a lot of support to come back right now. Everyone's in the middle of their campaigns. People are spread out across the state. It's kind of hard. It's pretty tough to bring everyone back like that in this point of the year.
Jeremy Duda of the Arizona Capital Times in Phoenix, thanks for being with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Many predict a ruling upholding the law, and that will trigger new legal action. Whose thumb is on that trigger? Dan Pacoda's. He's legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Arizona. What is the ACLU's position on SB 1070?
Well, the ACLU, of course, has been consistently opposed to 1070. Initially, we put in significant time while it was still in the legislative stage, trying to convince the folks in that branch of government of the great problems and inequities that would come about because of 1070. It was ill-conceived. It is ill-conceived. It had been tried piecemeal in years before when Governor Napolitano was still here and did not get through. And, of course, when Governor Brewer came in, there was no roadblock to getting the bill through as sponsored by Russell Pierce.
And once it became law, you filed a very early challenge to it, pretty comprehensive as you've described it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, we believe and feel strongly that the law is unconstitutional in any number of ways. We, and when I say we, the lead organizations are the ACLU, the National Immigration Law Center, and MALDEF, with quite a number of other organizations, legal organizations, Asian Pacific Organization, and others involved in the litigation, and quite a number of plaintiffs. We feel strongly that the law is clearly unconstitutional in any number of ways, preemption being one of them, but we have raised a significant array of constitutional issues that go beyond the Department of Justice's litigation, which is only based on preemption, and we will be litigating to the fullest all of those issues if any aspect of the law goes back into effect as a result of the Supreme Court's decision.
And preemption being the federal versus state issue, it's federal authority here versus state authority, correct?
Correct. It has to do with the conflict between the sovereign state versus the sovereign federal government. Our position as the DOJ's position was, the federal government is, that its immigration is uniquely a federal prerogative, and many cases have said so. We believe Judge Bolton was correct in ruling that the key provisions of the 1070 law were preempted by the federal government and should not be subject to state regulation. We should not have 50 states and a patchwork of regulation in this important national area. And we raised that as well in our lawsuit, as well as I said, the other constitutional issues.
And let's start with those other constitutional issues. First of all, you've raised First Amendment issues.
Right. We believe that a number of the provisions of 1070 raise important First Amendment issues concerning speech and expression and rights of association. And in fact, the only provision that has been enjoined separate from the Department of Justice lawsuit is one concerning one of the solicitation provisions in 1070, which Judge Bolton, based on our plaintiffs in the Friendly House case, it's the lead plaintiff in our case, raised and said it chilled speech and was unconstitutional. It was a content-based discrimination based on a viewpoint and a particular type of speech, i.e. solicitation for work. The court agreed with us, and so a portion of the law has been enjoined separate from the preemption decisions, and that decision by Judge Bolton is not up in front of the Supreme Court, so that particular provision of the 1070 will remain enjoined no matter what the Supreme Court does.
And then there are a couple of other amendments to the Constitution, the 4th and the 14th Amendments, that you raise, and those go to the heart of the argument that the law could lead to racial profiling. Is that not correct? Well,
it is correct. The 14th in particular. The 4th Amendment, which we feel is very strong, the judge indicated that she felt that our arguments on 4th Amendment grounds, specifically unreasonable seizures, and that this law will inevitably lead to detaining people for longer than is allowed under our Constitution, longer than the suspicion or cause would permit because of keeping people to get their status settled before they're released, and a number of other provisions. The Judge Bolton indicated in her earlier decision that we had made strong arguments. She didn't have to rule on them because the provision was being enjoined based on preemption. But we believe that the 4th Amendment's prohibition on unreasonable seizures will lead to enjoining a number of the provisions in this particular law. And secondly, as you mentioned, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, we believe will be inevitably and violated in a widespread manner. That is because of the racial profiling, that the law will lead to decisions being made based solely on the race and ethnicity of the targeted population, because as we've seen in Maricopa County as the prime example, and we mentioned this in our complaint in the Friendly House case, Mr. Arpaio has indicated, I didn't need 1070, I've been doing that already. That means, as we have seen in practice, racial profiling, selecting people solely on the basis of race, seeing if you can draw as wide a net as possible on brown-skinned people and then sorting them out after, turning the presumption of innocence on his head has been his M.O. In order to up his numbers that he can boast about for immigration enforcement, and this law will inevitably lead to the same results.
If, as many people anticipate, the Supreme Court upholds SB 1070, then what happens with your case?
Well, of course, there are 4 provisions that are up that have been enjoined by Judge Bolton. It may well be a split decision that some of them the court will find were properly found to have been preempted by Judge Bolton and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and some they may find were not, in their view, preempted, at least at this stage, the on-its-face stage, before information is put before the court about how it's working in practice. Of course, there's been no in practice yet. It hasn't been implemented. So it's very much still up in air, and it probably will not be a all-out decision one way or the other, but we're still optimistic, and we go from there. But if any of the provisions are put into effect, are allowed to go into play because the injunction is lifted and the court says it was done prematurely or whatever they say. Yes, we will be litigating fully. The case has been in limbo a bit for the last year and a half because the law has not been in effect. So we would be starting from scratch with all of our arguments and gathering of evidence and decisions about which provisions are amenable to immediate request to the court for preliminary injunctive relief.
So you would consider going to court and saying, put another freeze on this until we get our issues resolved?
Yeah, we have to do that in a provision-by-provision basis, as always, because they raise and implicate different aspects of the Constitution. But any of those that we feel, and we know there will be some, that do implicate the Constitution as written, that it's inevitable once this is put into effect, it will violate the Fourth Amendment or other rights. We will definitely go in as expeditiously as possible and try to, before it even gets implemented.
Another lawyer, one who handles illegal immigration cases on a regular basis, says the law actually provides protection for suspected immigrants that doesn't exist now. Juan Rocha, criminal defense lawyer in Tucson, handling a lot of immigration cases. Thanks for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
You say there's a positive aspect to SB 1070 from your perspective as a lawyer. What is that?
Well, I think one of the positive aspects, a positive aspect of SB 1070 is that it's sort of a secondary offense. In other words, police officers can only stop the person for committing some other crime before they can begin to ask questions regarding the person's status. Currently, under federal law, that doesn't exist. So Tucson Police Department officers, for example, can just approach someone and begin to ask them questions regarding their immigration status. And as a defense attorney, that's very difficult to actually challenge for racial profiling because we have no police reports, because they simply call ICE, and then ICE transfers them to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Now, should viewers be surprised that a criminal defense lawyer thinks there's actually something good about an anti-immigrant law?
Well, I wouldn't say it's good. I just don't think things can get any worse. Currently, under federal law, there's a program called Operation Streamline, in which the federal government, under the operation of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, actually prosecutes about 70 to 75 illegal immigrants every single day at the federal courthouse in Tucson, and about 40 defendants in the Yuma courthouse. So there's already programs that I think are more egregious than SB 1070, so I don't think this law itself can make things any worse.
Now, you mentioned racial profiling as an aspect of the entire immigration debate. There are protections in this law, proponents say, to prevent racial profiling. Do you think they're adequate?
Well, the way that the statute reads says that racial profiling is not allowed to the extent permitted by the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, I believe in 1977, in Brigo and Ponce, says that race can be used as a factor in developing reasonable suspicion. So you can't racially profile, but you certainly can use it as a factor in determining whether the person's actually in the country legally or not.
So how would that work in Arizona, where there's a huge Latino population and the vast majority of illegal immigrants are Latino? How does a law officer sort that out?
Well, that's a great question. In 2000, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals actually said that they modified the Supreme Court ruling and said that you can't use race at all, and even if as a factor to determine reasonable suspicion, especially in areas that are heavily populated by Hispanics, because they have no what they call probative value. So now officers have to come up with some other independent basis, at least in this part of the country, to determine whether the person's illegally in this country or not.
But that could differ from community to community, correct? In Tucson, for example, there's a very large Latino population, but maybe in some suburban areas there's not.
Right, and that's the irony here in the court. In the Ninth Circuit in 2000, when they said that, there are areas where maybe that you actually end up racially profiling people because there are not enough Hispanics there, where you could use it as a basis. But I think overall, the Ninth Circuit says that you can't use it as a basis to develop even reasonable suspicion.
Now, there's no ban on racial profiling at the federal level. It is used as a tool, as you've mentioned. And the Obama administration, in fact, didn't attack SB 1070 on that basis. Is that because it's a valid tool? Well,
racial profiling per se is not allowed. Taking race into account is a factor in developing reasonable suspicion. The Obama administration, as well as other organizations, actually challenged it, but Judge Bolton, in a footnote, said that I recognize that that's an issue, but I'm not going to address it. So that was never addressed in the pleadings, both at the district court level or at the Supreme Court level.
Now, there will be another case filed, assuming the Supreme Court upholds SB 1070, which is what many people are saying is going to happen, that will challenge it on civil rights and racial profiling issues. What do you think about that challenge?
Yeah, and I think those are all valid concerns that they should have. And I think that, as I said, it's not that SB 1070 is a good law. I just think that the way the law is now, we as defense attorneys don't have any mechanisms or tools to fight racial profiling. And here I think this might allow us some transparency to be able to fight that. So I think those lawsuits might serve us some good.
We have just about a minute remaining, a little less than that. In that time, tell me, do you think the clients you represent then would be well served by SB 1070 if it does go into effect?
Whether it's in effect or not, my clients are not served by it at all because it's already a crime to be in the country illegally. So even before SB 1070, the federal government was already prosecuting people who were here in the country illegally anyway. So my clients don't stand to benefit one way or the other.
Juan Rocha, criminal defense lawyer in Tucson, thanks so much for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Why all the political, social, and media attention to this issue? Because of Arizona's and the nation's burgeoning Latino population. Here's Joseph Garcia, an analyst of Latino public policy issues for the Morrison Institute at Arizona State University. Morrison has done some research on Arizonans' attitudes about immigration, especially illegal immigration. Can you tell us what some of those findings are?
Well, it's interesting because Arizonans believe in a pathway to citizenship, and at the same time they believe in securing the borders and enforcement of the law. So it looks like there's a little bit of disagreement amongst themselves when it comes to these views, but I think you have to look at a little bit about what's behind each and individual question in the polls.
So let's talk about some of those questions. Let's start with the DREAM Act, because that's very much in the news, with President Obama having just given a 2-year pass, if you will, to young people in the country illegally, seeking an education or seeking military service. What do Arizonans say about that?
Well, we took a poll in Arizonans. Actually, 3/4 of Arizonans were in favor of the DREAM Act, which of course goes farther than what Barack Obama is proposing, because it's not a 2-year deal. The DREAM Act would be permanent residency, and Arizonans are in support of that. So 3/4 of us, Arizonans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, are in favor of the DREAM Act.
And that poll, of course, was taken before President Obama's action last week, correct?
Yes, that one's from April. So, but it's still pretty recent.
And then in regard to long-time illegal immigrants in the United States, what did polling find?
Well, the pathway to citizenship, it was 78%. There are some conditions, of course, to the pathway to citizenship. So no one is talking about waving a magic wand and there's instant amnesty. But the idea is if you've lived here a long time, you pass a criminal background check, both here and in the nation you're coming from, and that you get a taxpayer ID, you demonstrate you can speak English. Essentially, if you go through all the motions that most people would go through to become a U.S. citizen, if you do that, longtime residents, most Arizonans overwhelmingly think that there should be a pathway to citizenship.
And then back to what you said earlier, Arizonans also, though, favor aspects of SB 1070 and have gone to the voting booth over the last decade or so, favoring tougher immigration laws. How do you explain that dichotomy?
Well, I think it was 64% of Arizonans said they were in support of all the aspects in SB 1070, which is pretty high. But I think you need to look at SB 1070 understanding that most people talk about it not having read the components of the law. They talk about the idea of SB 1070. And I think that the idea Arizonans go back to that enforcement aspect, that they do want law enforcement officers to have that opportunity to investigate a crime or an episode and see if someone is here legally.
So what will settle this issue once and for all in Arizona, or will it ever be settled?
Well, there's a few things that will settle it. I think, one is comprehensive immigration reform policy from Congress. We're not too successful on that in recent years, so I'm thinking that might be, some people think it's an impossibility, because until there's compromise by both sides, one side is pretty much saying instant amnesty in the extremes, the other side is saying deport them all, which is an extreme. Both of those extremes have to move towards the middle and compromise. And compromise is all about two sides coming together, probably neither side being totally happy with the result. But that has to happen with Congress. So, I mean, a presidential election is going to take place. I think there's an opportunity then to take it out of the political arena and talk about policy. Because what we have now, everyone agrees is a broken policy. It doesn't work. Well, why can't we fix it? But then, of course, you're talking about Latino voters, too. And if the emerging Latino vote comes into fruition, like many people have been predicting for years now, but if the younger population who now are eligible to vote do vote, and if the older population, which traditionally have not voted, do vote, they could have an impact at the ballot box.
What other aspects of public policy that affect Latinos or the whole state in regard to Latinos is the Morrison Institute looking at right now?
Well, we're looking at Latino public policy very seriously, and we're looking at establishing a center, launching a center, because as Latinos go, so goes Arizona. I mean, the population coming up, the younger population, is very heavily Latino. 88% of Latino youth under 20 are natural citizens or were born here. So we're talking about a U.S. citizen Latino population coming up. There's the myth that all the Latino youth coming up are here illegally. It's just not true. In fact, when you talked about children under 5 here in Arizona, 97% of Arizona Latino children under 5 are U.S. citizens. They were born here. So we're talking about U.S. citizens that are coming up. So Arizona needs to move beyond the denial somehow of thinking that all Latino youth are here illegally and realize, no, these are our fellow Arizonans. These are our citizens. What do we do from a public policy standpoint to improve? We just did a report called Dropped, which was looking at Latino education gap, because there is a large one where Latinos largely drop out of school, or they don't finish high school, they certainly don't finish college, and there's a gap there. If we don't close that gap, since Latinos are coming up as largely our workforce, our main workforce, all of Arizona's median income drops. We can't compete for the jobs, we can't compete for the industry, we can't compete for new business. It drops. And so either we have people, and this is the decision that Arizona's decision makers have to make, either we have people paying into the system or people taking out of the system. This hasn't stuck up on anybody. It's just a matter of if we want to address it. And the whole idea is that Latino public policy is important to all of Arizona. And all Arizonans need to understand why Latino public policy is important. For too long, we've divided the state too much into Latinos and non-Latinos. We need to bridge that and understand that both sides are Arizona. What can we do to move everyone forward as a state together?
That's our program for Friday, June 22nd, 2012. We'll have comprehensive coverage of the SB 1070 decision next week on Arizona Illustrated, NPR 89.1, and our website, azpm.org. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Chihak.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.